This video will cover number 14 and 15, the final two proofs in your Chapter 5 test review. In number 14, we are given some information, and we are trying to prove that line segment MN is congruent to line segment RS. So where are those two line segments? One is here in the triangle on the left, and one is here in the triangle on the right. Now, before we can try to prove that the segments are congruent, we first need to prove, I'm going to put a little note, first prove that the triangles are congruent. Once we prove the triangles are congruent, we can say that these corresponding parts are congruent. And so our job again is to go ahead and try to find one of these congruence theorems in this situation so we can prove the triangles are congruent. I'm going to go ahead and set up my two-column proof because I did not have mine set up for me. And let's start with the first given statement. P is the midpoint of line segment NS. Let's go ahead and think about what that means. Here's point P, and here's line segment NS. It's this whole bottom segment here. If P is the midpoint, it is in the middle of line segment NS. And what that means is if P is in the middle, it divides line segment NS into two congruent pieces. That means line segment NP here must be the same length or congruent to line segment SP here. If you put your tick marks in the picture, we need to go ahead and put that in our proof. So I'm going to now state, because P was the midpoint, line segment NP is congruent to line segment SP. And I used the definition of midpoint to figure that out. So I'm just going to put a little check next to this first given. I used that to help me find one pair of congruent sides. Let's go ahead and put in our second given. So this will be our third statement. Angle N is congruent to angle S. I'm going to go ahead and mark that in our picture. Angle N is congruent to angle S. That gives us one pair of congruent angles. Our final given, let's add that in the proof. Angle MPN is congruent to angle RPS. We need to mark these angles in our picture. Angle MPN, that is this angle here, is congruent to angle RPS, that is this angle here. That gets us a second pair of congruent angles. I have three congruent parts. I am now ready to check to see which of my 5 congruence theorems I can use to prove the triangles are congruent. I have an angle, a side in between the two angles, and another angle. So I know these two triangles must be congruent by the angle side angle theorem. We need to add that to our proof. Triangle, I'll call this triangle MPN. I know it is congruent to triangle RPS by the angle side angle theorem. Now, finally, we need to go ahead, don't forget to prove that line segment MN is congruent to line segment RS. So now that we've established that the triangles are congruent, we know that these corresponding segments must also be congruent. So finally, line segment MN is congruent to line segment RS And remember that reason we say this is true because corresponding parts of congruent triangles must be congruent.